This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Welcome to another episode of Cal's Corner here on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. Rob McConnell is the executive producer of the show, and my name is Kal Korff, and I'm the host. Folks, welcome back. It's been a couple weeks since we've done an episode, and I have to admit that that's entirely my fault. I was recently on some travel and went different places and was just not able to logistically make it work, and I'm sorry for that. But it's good to be back after a couple weeks. I hope everybody had a good Merry Christmas, and of course, I wish you the best for the upcoming new year. Now, speaking of years and the new year coming up, let's dedicate this show to reviewing some of the incredible history that has happened and is epitomized by this past year. And we're talking about history around the world. It's not U.S.-centric or Canadian-specific. It is truly a global world out there. And increasingly, events happen every day to remind us that not only are we all human beings, but that everything is interconnected, that life itself, the universe itself, is one big relational database. So let's go ahead and review some of what has happened and discuss some of the minutiae of that and tie it in with current events because they're still relevant. Well, on the one hand, we have to remember that last year in 2016, there was this truly, genuinely historic election in the United States to determine who was going to be the next president of the United States. What made this election rather interesting is you had the establishment, as epitomized by Democrat Hillary Clinton, running against a couple of candidates whose very candidacy was an uprising from the people in a way. In other words, kind of a rebellion, if you will, a people's movement. First, there was Hillary Clinton's rival, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. And while he is not historically been a strong Democrat, he ran on the Democratic ticket, but he's really more of an independent. And of course, he loved to use the word socialism and tell everybody that he was a socialist and still is to this day. And I have to remind people that the very definition of socialism has changed over the years. Historically, socialism has never worked. Probably the epitome of it is best illustrated by the former USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which thankfully no longer exists, but of course brutally oppressed people for many decades. So you had Bernie Sanders running as a so-called revised or today's definition of socialism, which is more... It's not close to the old definition. It's kind of a new definition of it, where the common theme there is that you have a lot of big government and the government subsidizing via tax dollars various programs that go on for people, including education and healthcare, of course. And then you had on the Republican side of the ticket, you had a candidate who was dismissed by all the so-called pundits and analysts even before he announced he was running for president. He had thrown out hints out there that he was going to run, and nobody took him seriously. And then after he announced that he was running for president, everyone said, oh, you can't win a single primary. And then should you win the nomination, there's no way you're going to beat Hillary Clinton. And of course, we're talking about the billionaire real estate mogul, Donald Trump. Now, Trump, of course, went on to beat Hillary Clinton. I was one of the few journalists who predicted that actually Trump would win. And I based that analysis not because I have some great expertise on this subject. I don't profess to have that. But I was listening from India to what my fellow Americans were saying, and I could detect that there was this mood, not necessarily to elect Trump, but to elect what he symbolized, which in theory was the nonconformist candidate, so-called somebody who would put your interests first rather than those of vested interests, because Trump, of course, paid for his own campaign. and funded large parts of it, not all of it, but many parts of it, and of course didn't take the large donations that Hillary Clinton did from various vested interests, which is what the Clintons do, the so-called pay-to-play business model that they have. So what happens is against the so-called expertise and predictions by the mainstream media, this included everything from the New York Times to CNN, of course, they predicted Hillary would win. That is not what happened because the United States is an electoral system. Donald Trump won. Just enough Americans voted for Trump, and he sits in the White House today. Now, after Trump won the election, the question became, what happens to the United States? Trump had made tons of promises like other candidates did, and the question was he going to keep them? Well, one of Trump's famous vague promises was that he was going to drain the swamp in Washington, D.C. And while he has done that to a degree, the very term drain the swamp is a bit relative because it didn't mention what he was going to replace the swamp with, meaning was he going to put more alligators in it, and who was it that he was going to drain? A lot of people assume these would be the vested interests in Washington, D.C. Yet Trump didn't do that. As I reported in a lengthy article that was published in the newspapers, what Trump did is he has stocked his cabinet with many millionaires, several of them, and of course they don't live in the same world that the average person does who is not a billionaire. And so Trump has a cabinet full of rich elite people, and that seems to go against his popular message that he needs to rebel against such types and such rich financial vested interests. And of course, if you fast forward now today to the tax cuts that have just recently been signed into law, passed by Trump and the Republicans, brokered largely by his daughter Ivanka, you can see that the rich, of course, once again, have gotten away with what they're very good at, and that is getting most of the breaks where it comes to tax cuts. In other words, this tax cut, although it is projected to affect roughly 193 million Americans, is a huge sop for the rich. It's not going to benefit the middle class the way that it benefits the upper elite who don't need the money, but they're getting it anyway in the form of this tax cut. Now, I agree that taxes should be as low as possible. They should be just enough to cover the expenses of what you need to pay your bills. And if there's any surplus, it must go back to the American people. And that, of course, is the law that the U.S. has. And that actually happened when George Bush was president after he succeeded Bill Clinton because there was a surplus. The modern liberal, liberal myth is that the surplus occurred because of the great governance that Bill Clinton did, but that's not true. If you look at the congressional record, the reason there was a surplus is because Clinton's feet were held to fire by the Republicans at the time and Newt Gingrich and his bunch, and because of the compromises that were made in the spirit of democracy, cooperative democracy, the cuts that were made and the compromises that were made allowed that surplus to happen. If Clinton had his way and had gotten everything he wanted, there would not have been the surplus that ended up working out and then transferred back to the American people in the form of a tax refund, one-time tax refund that occurred in 2001 when Bush became the president. So Donald Trump became president. It not only shocked certainly most Americans and so-called political experts, it also shocked the world. Having lived outside the United States, in India, and of course remaining in touch with many friends in Europe, because I was in Europe for 10 years, I can guarantee you that Trump's win was a huge shock globally, and you could see it among other world leaders. You may remember the essential crying and screaming, more or less, that European leaders started to pour out the moment Trump was elected, because Trump had told them some blunt things that European leaders did not want to hear, and other American politicians, such as his predecessor, Barack Obama, had largely avoided. They were inconvenient truths, such as the fact that many European allies were not paying their fair share of the financial burdens and material commitments that are required to maintain the defensive and offensive capabilities of the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, or the group that is known as NATO. And of course, Russia wasn't going to sit there and say, you didn't pay your bills this year, so you're not as capable to defend yourself as you would have been the year before when you were not playing these games financially. Russia didn't say anything. And during this laissez-faire period of time during the last few years when Obama was president and he let these countries off the hook, Russia used that opportunity to update their armed forces. They actually paid the French and the Germans, of all people, to modernize their military. And the result of that, the world got to see when the Russians essentially annexed and took over illegally under international law the small area of Crimea, which of course used to belong to the Ukrainian government or country of Ukraine. You may remember the so-called Little Green Men, as they were nicknamed in the media. These were the elite troops that were armed with state-of-the-art weaponry, and every trooper himself seemed to have a mode of independent communication, most likely even an IP chip inside their helmet, like American soldiers do. You will see that that is the result of the upgrade that the Russians made to their military after falling behind the West for many years. And there were initial reactions from that from the defense industry. Some analysts were freaking out in the mainstream media that, hey, this is proof that, NATO can't hold its own against Russia anymore. Well, actually, it wasn't. Putin had upgraded about 100 to 110,000 of his troops. All of them, for all practical purposes, were deployed in their first major exercise in a real-world situation where potential combat might happen or conflict with the West when they were deployed to Crimea and Ukraine to oversee that situation. And as history proved, not a single shot was fired. No one was hurt regarding the deployment of those people. There were no gunfights, at least regarding those individuals. And the transition or coup, if you will, went off relatively peaceful. On the other hand, in the Ukrainian parliament itself, pro-Russian forces entered that parliament, closed the doors, deployed armed guards, and essentially said to all of the representatives in the parliament, you're either for Putin or you're against him. Those who are against him, leave. Those who are for him, stay. That's exactly what happened. And then Putin had in place the number of people necessary to do his so-called referendum in parliament to go ahead and accept the vote in the transition to Russia of the area known as Crimea. And once again, Putin did this in response to retaliations from the West over their participation in and fueling of the coup, which ousted the prior president of the Ukraine, who was, of course, a sock puppet of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because those events that occurred years ago, when the people rose up to fight against the president of Ukraine and the fact that he was a puppet of Putin's in Russia, he had promised his people, the Ukrainians, that they would lean more towards the West, they would join the European Union, they would enter into further economic dependency on the West, and of course eventually join NATO. And Ukraine, of course, is right next to the border of Russia. And what happened instead is he changed his mind, and in exchange for a loan of roughly $12 to $12.5 billion from Putin, it was given to the people of Ukraine or the leadership of Ukraine on the condition that they not join or get closer to the West, because the last thing the Russians want is for Ukraine to join NATO and to have NATO forces put up yet against another section of their border with the European Union. Instead, what Putin wants is for Ukraine to be compliant to Russia, or at the very least to be a neutral buffer zone so that there are no military weapons there. It's kind of demilitarized. Now, neither situation is happening at present because it's a bit of a stalemate, but when Putin seized the Crimea in response to this coup that ousted his puppet president, what happened then is that Barack Obama started imposing sanctions, and the whole situation went downhill from there. So we'll come back after this break and continue a recap here and explain why the events in Ukraine are very relevant to President Donald Trump today in the White House.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Welcome to segment 2 here on Kal's Corner Radio Show on the X-Zone Broadcast Network here on xzbn.net. Rob McConnell again is the executive producer of the show. My name is Kal Korff and I'm your host. Now, we were speaking in the opening segment, a brief recap of the big story of 2016, in which Donald Trump became president of the United States of America, a position he still holds, of course, occupying the White House, much to the consternation of the Democratic Party and at least those who voted for Hillary Clinton. Now, we then talked before the commercial break about Russia, Crimea, Ukraine, and why it was relevant to Donald Trump's presidency as well as candidacy. And the reason that this is the case, folks, has to do with this. Now, you can imagine that for those of you who don't remember the collapse of the former Soviet Union, of course, it was an alliance, a forced alliance of many European countries as well as provinces in Russia, forcibly put together by the use of military force, oppression, genocide, mass murder, and so on. The Communist Party, which used to rule over Russia, as well as communism itself, you can look this up in the history books, is directly, wholly, and only responsible for murdering hundreds of millions of people ever since it took hold in Russia. And of course, even more people were murdered in communist China. And China, of course, today is still communist, although it has a healthy dose of totalitarian capitalism that is running that oppressive dictatorship there. So what happened when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union went to the ash heap of history, you had the country of Ukraine, which at that time had the world's third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not exaggerating. In fact, the Ukraine had its own set of weapons given to it by the Russians, everything from nuclear cruise missiles to intercontinental ballistic missiles. And what happened was what to do with these missiles as Russia or the USSR imploded. Well, thankfully, the Ukrainians agreed to give them all back to Russia in exchange for what was basically called a security agreement. And this agreement was signed by the United States, Great Britain, France, even communist China. And what it basically said was, if Russia ever tries to mess with you or seize your lands again or take you over, we will defend you, prevent that from happening. And yes, we will work the issue of trying to make you a member of NATO one day. So the Ukrainians agreed to the deal. Thankfully, they gave up all their nuclear weapons. They went back to Russia. And amazingly, to the credit of then Russian President Boris Yeltsin, as well as then President George H.W. Bush. Some of the credit also goes to Ronald Reagan, his predecessor. Thankfully, none of these nuclear weapons fell into rogue hands or into the hands of terrorists, and cities didn't start disappearing or weapons were not unaccounted for, as a rule, that type thing. In fact, the United States What it did in a series of secret operations is it hired thousands of Russian nuclear scientists and continued paying them their salaries even if they did nothing at all. And this was to keep them from falling into the hands of the enemy to be hired by rogue nations who might put them to work making rogue nuclear weapons. Countries like Syria, Iran, Iraq at the time, and North Korea come to mind as examples of where these people could have applied their deadly skills if it were not for the money paid to keep them off the market, literally, by the CIA and the United States of America. So what happened was, when the Ukraine gave up their weapons, the plan was to eventually make them part of the European Union and eventually part of NATO. It would be done over a period of time. It wasn't going to happen overnight. It would take years. And of course, in order for any country to join the European Union, there were other countries in the queue before Ukraine, such as what was later called the Czech Republic, or formerly Czechoslovakia, other countries like Greece who had yet to join. And there was this long queue to transition nations that used to be part of the former Iron Curtain countries into NATO allies. And of course, countries like Slovakia, countries like Greece and others, they ended up joining NATO, as did Bulgaria and so on. So what happened all these years, that the transition from former Warsaw Pact countries such as Poland, which again later joined NATO, during those years, the Russians could do nothing to stop the growth of NATO, and NATO expanded up to the borders of Russia to the point where the Russians were really concerned about this. And this is ironic because let's be very blunt about this issue. If there were a conventional war ever fought, God forbid, between the Russian Red Army or its forces and NATO, the odds are that Russia would win. The reason has to do with physics. Not only are there a lot more Russian soldiers on the Russian side of this military equation, but they outnumber the West 3-1 in tanks. They would have the distinct home field advantage geographically. It would take the United States many months to move the massive amounts of material to fight a conventional war against Russia. The only way to beat Russia would be to go nuclear. And then that's when you don't win, you actually lose, because you cannot control the radioactive fallout from a nuclear bomb. So yes, you might be able to destroy a city, but then where does that radioactivity go? It could come back into your country and cause problems for you. So as President Reagan famously said, a nuclear war must never be fought and can never be won. And he was right about that. So what happened was, as Ukraine got in the queue to slowly transition everything over, Vladimir Putin eventually took over Russia, rose to power, and he inherited a crisis from his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin ended up being very corrupt, despite being a fairly honest politician when he entered politics and became famous and replaced Gorbachev. Yeltsin's daughter ended up essentially stealing or plundering the Russian treasury, moving about $1 billion, it may have been as much as $10 billion, into secret bank accounts in Switzerland. So a deal was cut between Putin and his allies. Putin had been the mayor of St. Petersburg, that Vladimir Putin would replace Yeltsin in exchange for not being prosecuted. So Yeltsin resigned early. Putin temporarily ran things, then formally declared himself to be a candidate, won that election fair and square, let's give him credit. And Putin seemed to be at that time the right man at the right time at the right place to lead Russia forward. Yet Putin himself was not the same kind of person that Yeltsin was. Putin, in fact, ran KGB operations out of for the Kremlin on behalf of Russia, out of East Germany. He loved it in East Germany. He's been fluent in German for many years. And he has described in melodramatic terms, but he's really sincere when he says this, that in his view, one of the greatest tragedies, if not the greatest tragedy to ever befall Russia, was the fall of the former Soviet Union. And while he said that he has no plans to take the country back in that direction, and of course he can't do that, it's unrealistic, the fact is he missed those days, and he resented Russian power being deflated from where it was as being a rival superpower to the so-called mighty United States of America. So at the end of the Cold War, when it ended, it left only one superpower remaining. That, of course, was the United States. Russia had its own problems internally. To try to fix them, it was not going to invade other countries and flex its military might. It was financially broke and bankrupt. Then you had a problem under Yeltsin that Yeltsin started selling off state enterprises to private enterprises. The problem was who he sold them to. They were not necessarily legal or nice guys or moral guys. Instead, a lot of them were aligned with the Russian mafia or criminal elements. And under Putin, a understanding was reached that the criminal elements, the rich oligarchs, they were oligarchs by now, controlling billions of dollars in key industries, and the Russian government would form a triangle partnership, if you will, and divide the spoils between themselves. Putin would make sure that enough money was given to the average Russian so that the quality of life would improve. The idea was if you give the people enough and you satisfy them, they're not going to plot revolutions against you. Putin also was expected, and did to a degree, rein in some of the oligarchs. The oligarchs had a choice to make, as well as Russian mafia figures. Either you back Putin or you're going to be on the wrong end of the stick and you will be declared an enemy and he will come get you and drive you out of the country or confiscate your wealth. And that has happened to some of his opponents. In fact, some of his opponents, even in the media, have ended up dead. Now, this doesn't mean that Putin himself gave the orders to eliminate these people. It could have been anybody who felt that needed to be done as a favor to him. Who knows? But the fact is that critics who tend to be or show some signs of success against Putin, they tend not to live long, even if they live in other countries or are in hiding in Great Britain, as we saw the case of one of Putin's key opponents who was poisoned with the radioactive element of polonium and died a very painful death. That was a Russian hit, if you will, that was carried out in London in Great Britain several years ago. So what happened is, as Ukraine went to get its independence, it turns out that a man named Paul Manafort, who has now been indicted for under criminal charges, and including money laundering by the FBI, it turns out that he was one of the key foreign lobbyists who helped the former president of Ukraine not only rise to power in politics, creating a brand new party backed by an oligarch, but he helped put him in power. And this is where understanding the recent probes that have been launched ever since Trump became president about alleged collusion with the Kremlin and even Vladimir Putin, maybe a secret deal was cut between Trump and Putin, although I doubt it. This is where this stuff began, because Manafort later went on to serve as an advisor to Donald Trump in the final stretch of his presidential campaign. And Manafort played a key role, as did Steve Bannon, former Breitbart fame, of getting Trump elected. So let's look at this dynamic here, and we'll continue after the commercial break to go into it more further. But the dynamic is this. If you are a wealthy individual, or any individual who starts cutting business deals with foreign powers, especially those who are doing the bidding of Russian President Vladimir Putin, you're going to come to the attention, if you will, of various intelligence communities and entities around the world. It is inconceivable to imagine that Paul Manafort or any American could be paid millions of dollars to advise and help put someone in power that Vladimir Putin was controlling and not come to the attention of numerous intelligence agencies, even in the Ukraine as well as Poland and other countries throughout Europe. They, of course, would share information with the United States, and an investigation, a very covert one, and monitoring would take place. The CIA and other entities and the NSA would start listening in on their associates to see what they're doing, because everything is connected to everything else. If Putin is paying people like Manafort through his proxies or even straight up to help get their candidates into office to do their bidding, you're going to go on the radar of the intelligence community, you might as well send up a red flare because you're going to come under their scrutiny. And we'll come back after the break and we'll talk about more of that and how it unfolded in just a moment.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
Welcome back to the third segment of this show here on Kal's Corner radio show here on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. Again, the executive producer is Mr. Rob McConnell, and my name is Kal Korff, and I'm your host. So, folks, we were talking about Ukraine, Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort was a well-known individual, especially to the government of the United States, as well as governments around the world. He has been a long-time political operative going back decades. In fact, he made a name for himself helping the Republicans when they had a candidate back then called Ronald Reagan. He was successful there. And he later went on to help other political figures around the world, including various powers in Africa, as well as even the former dictator of the Philippines, President Ferdinand Marcos, going back decades. So Manafort was a known entity. He had opened up a political lobbying and consulting firm, and he was paid millions of dollars by a Ukrainian oligarch who, of course, was a collaborator with Vladimir Putin, to get the former president of Ukraine, who was ousted in a popular uprising, to put him into power, and they were successful at that. Once he was in power, he then broke the promises to continue the push to the West and joining the EU and integrating with NATO, and that upset Ukrainians who were understandably angry over that sudden reversal. They rose up, ousted him from power, and then Manafort, during that time, of course, was being spied on by many intelligence agencies. And then when he began to work for the Trump company, or Trump campaign, a lot of those entities that were spying on him and collecting information continued to do so. And it is that information that was collected at that time, as well as subsequent surveillance, that got Manafort indicted recently by the special prosecutor and former director of the FBI, Robert Mueller. Now, people may say, well, how was Mueller able to build his case so fast? The reason Mueller has been able to do that is because Mueller, like former FBI Director James Comey and previous U.S. Department of Justice officials, such as Eric Holder and the former director Loretta Lynch, the reason they're able to put a lot of these facts together quickly is because they've always known where the bodies have been buried. And what I mean by that statement is this. The United States unquestionably has a rather curious track record of being very selective, where it prosecutes or decides to execute what it calls so-called justice. Okay? If you look at the symbol for the Department of Justice, it is a woman holding up a scale, and she's wearing a blindfold because she's not supposed to be biased. But the U.S. government has been biased in the past. It has been very selective. You may remember a few years ago that 10 Russians were busted during the tenure of American President Barack Obama and Attorney General Eric Holder. They were spying, of course. They were deported out of the country. While the Obama administration must be commended for rounding them up and getting rid of them, what they didn't really talk about was what those Russians were doing. Well, it turns out that they were involved in some stuff that still years later now is under investigation by Mueller. This includes the Uranium One deal, where Russia was given permission to buy and increase its stake in a uranium mine, which gave it control of key parts of the uranium market. And people who are anti-Russian, or at least believe that the United States should not be helping Vladimir Putin buy uranium to build more nuclear weapons. Hillary Clinton was involved in that deal as well, briefly, as in her capacity as Secretary of State. When you put all of that stuff together, you'll see that even though the FBI knew that there was corruption and bribes being paid, including involving a Canadian trucking firm that would move the uranium back and forth for exporting and importing, they knew all this was going on. They still let the deal proceed. And then years later, when Mueller comes along, because he was aware of it earlier in his career, he could pick up the ball from there and tie together some loose ends and essentially come up with some of the indictments that have been released so far. In fact, there was a press report 2 days ago that there may be more indictments for money laundering charges against Manafort as early as this week. So the reason this is important is because, as I've always said, as somebody who has researched this firsthand, the United States government has cut deals with criminal organizations in the past, and they do it on a case-by-case basis. So this idea of justice, liberty, freedom for all, we're all equal under the law, yes, in theory, but in reality, that's not the case. We must remember that the Democrats during World War II, when President Franklin Roosevelt was the leader of the United States, they cut a deal with the Justice Department, with their full blessing, to work with the Italian Mafia and the Irish Mafia and some other mafia entities to help defeat the Nazis and Germany. The Mafia, of course, hated Mussolini because he was bad for their business. They didn't have any love for Hitler. But a secret deal was cut with Lucky Luciano, as in the Lucky Luciano from history, who was, of course, the most powerful mafia figure during his time. And the deal was basically this. Lucky Luciano, through his contacts, would make sure that there was no German sabotage occurring on the docks where the mafias controlled the unions run by the Italians in the United States. And, of course, the mafia was all too willing to help American troops recapture the island of Sicily and put it back under the possession, if you will, at least during the war, of the Allied forces and take it away from Italy. And, of course, they helped prepare the way for American forces to land on mainland Italy itself. The mafia was very glad to help. And in exchange for that, the U.S. government left alone the big fish. When they would arrest people, they would go for the less important figures. And this type of agreement went on for years, for decades. It still continues today. And in the 1970s, it occurred in various forms, disguised as détente, where mafia elements or criminal elements, often masquerading as Jews who were persecuted, were released from prisons in Russia, sent to the United States, brought in as so-called immigrants, and then they would do Moscow's bidding. And this is exactly how the Russian mafia got its tentacles and hooks into the United States, especially on the East Coast, and of course even as far as California. Now, what happened in the 1960s, and we know more about this due to the release of recently declassified data concerning the late President John F. Kennedy's assassination, we know, of course, and this has long been public record since the 1970s, thanks to investigations by Senator Frank Church during the decade of the 70s, we know that Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy worked together, as in gave it the official blessing to work with the mafia to try to kill former Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. In exchange for killing Castro, not only were they offered cash, which the mafia refused, apparently around $100,000, but they were given essentially a pass, a go pass, if you will, not to be prosecuted. And if you look at the Kennedy brothers, that's rather ironic, because one of their shticks to try to climb the ladder in political office and in the eyes of the average voter was to boast about how tough they were on organized crime. And of course, Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General. But yet, if you look at their track record, they never did bust the big top 3 gangsters. The reason they didn't do that is because they were in bed, doing deals with them. And also, even John F. Kennedy's father went ahead and had worked a deal with the Irish Mafia and the Italian Mafia, and they earned some of their money well before John F. Kennedy became president. Part of the Kennedy family fortune was because of illegal running of liquor and working with the Italian mafias. So it turns out that the government is not always clean. What they have done with the Russian mafia is they have pardoned people like Felix Sater, who, in exchange for not being prosecuted and telling the U.S. government and helping it work to keep Stinger missiles out of the hands of terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan, Loretta Lynch and other attorney generals, including the FBI, have let Russian mafia figures like Felix Sater essentially go free. He never spent a single day in jail, has not been prosecuted. In fact, he openly brags and boasts about his cooperation with the U.S. government. It's actually quite amazing, as we mentioned on previous shows, that he's still walking around and is alive and nothing's happened to him. So justice, at least in this sense and in these examples, can be selective at best. And this is where Robert Mueller's inquiry is rather interesting, because Mueller is trying his usual tactics of playing hardball, of fishing in areas where he knows he's not going to win. But if he lines up enough intimidation and threats of force and prosecution and, just trying to really squeeze his targets, maybe somebody will cough up something. So the issue becomes, did Trump collaborate with the Russians? Was there a quid pro quo? Was the hacking of the Democratic National Party's computers done as part of a collusion where the Kremlin, using their hacking prowess, would go ahead and get the files from the party? Then they would go ahead and leak damaging information to the Trump campaign. As I have said before, and I'm predicting again still, by the time Mueller's investigation is done, and I have no ego in this, so if it turns out it's not the case, fine. If it is, that's fine too. I really don't care one way or another. I just care that the truth come out, whatever the truth is. I predict that there will be no evidence of collusion found. Now, when I say collusion, I mean direct deals, quid pro quo style, like the media loves to imply have happened, between Trump and Putin directly. Now, this is not to say that people around these two individuals may or may not have been working certain issues either on their behalf, on their own initiative, or they were smart enough to realize, hey, if I did this for Trump, I'm sure he wouldn't object, but of course I'm not going to bother him until I've got something solid or worked out so that we can either do this or not. Because if you look at the coverage of this event and how it's been portrayed by the media, there have been some brazen, blatant errors which are really inexcusable. You have the claim that the computers were hacked at the Democratic National Party, and of course WikiLeaks published a lot of these emails showing that there was a conspiracy among the Democrats to rig the election essentially for Hillary Clinton. There's no surprise there if you know who the Clintons are and what their past history has been. But they were not hacked. That is a lie. Instead, they were phished, as in P-H-I-S-H-E-D, and there's a key difference between being phished and being hacked. And let me give you the short version of how that works. All of you who use emails will often get phony emails from often your internet provider or other ones such as Google or Microsoft or Yahoo and so on. Some of these emails, which have been floating around for many years, will say, you have to log in and immediately change your password because it may have been compromised, or to be safe, do this. And they give you a link and you click on it, and it turns out it's not really from Yahoo or your provider. Instead, it is a fake email that the moment you click on that link, a virus gets downloaded, or it may go to a page that looks like your provider's page. And when you input the new password that you've changed it to, you're sending it to the bad guys. They can then use it to get into your stuff, or they can, essentially hack you at that point. And this is exactly what had happened to the Democratic National Party. They got a phony email from Google. They bit on that hoax, and they gave the password straight to the Kremlin. There was no break-in because it wasn't necessary. The information was voluntarily coughed up via this phony email. So after the station break here, we'll go ahead and explain how this was finally done and wrap this up and explain how it's relevant to what's going to happen in 2018.
The Earth is under ever-increasing pressure from untenable lifestyles and growing populations. Yet, viable answers seem in short supply. What if I told you there's an ancient form that can empower you to take charge of your life? What if your entire family could be enfolded and supported by life itself, finding safe passage through challenging times? I'm Gwilda Wiyaka, founder and director of Path Home Shamanic Art School, with great news: an upcoming series of leading-edge online affordable classes based in an ancient form of shamanism, easily learned and used by your entire family. Galactic Shamanism, Art of the Ancients, Key to Tomorrow are a series of online adult and children's lessons instructing your entire family on natural law, how to cooperate with and be supported by the powers of the universe. Visit findyourpathhome.com to find these unique and powerful classes.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan, and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
Welcome back to the fourth and final segment of Kal's Corner Radio Show here on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. My name, once again, is Kal Korff, and I'm your host, and the executive producer of the show is the one and only legendary, my honest opinion here, Rob McConnell. Now, as we were saying, and boy, every time I do this show, time goes by so fast. We were talking about Paul Manafort, the possible collusion of Trump and the Russians, hacking, or as it was reported, hacking of the computers at the Democratic National Party. Why it wasn't really hacking, it was really phishing. So after the Democrats, specifically John Podesta's IT person and people associated with Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, stupidly changed their password and gave it to the bad guys so that they could be phished, WikiLeaks got that material. They famously published it. And, of course, that put the Clinton campaign in damage control mode, because if they talked about the damaging revelations in the emails, it would distract from her campaign and, of course, bust her. She didn't want that. If they ignored it, then she would just have to take incoming attacks all the time and appear helpless. So either way, it really had an effect on how her campaign responded. It is doubtful that the email scandal caused her to lose the election based on studies that have been done and exit polls of voters, because Trump did win the election in our electoral system. The bottom line as to why Hillary lost the election is because not enough Americans liked her, period. She was the worst candidate the Democrats could have put forward. In the eyes of most Americans, she did not represent real change. Instead, she represented a continuation of the Obama term in office, a third term as they called it. And she represented, as I've reported before, more chump change instead of change that one could really believe in, because Obama didn't really believe or deliver on real change either. It was just all empty rhetoric. So the reason these past associations with the Russian mafia, people like Paul Manafort working for Russian oligarchs, doing Putin's bidding, and even John Podesta's brother, who has now resigned from his own lobbying firm because he also helped the Russians and Putin. The reason these are important, these events that happened before Trump even ran for president, is because the parties involved, from the law enforcement investigators, again like Mueller, to the actual people who did the work, these would be people like Manafort, they all know what each other one has done. It's just a question of how much they know. They're familiar with their colleagues, contacts, what they've done over the years. The evidence has always been there. And now that you've got potential crimes that have been committed because of the election and other activities such as money laundering, which is independent of whoever won the White House, you have this landmine that you have to navigate through, where you have to still nail the bad guys. But, you know, like the Felix Sater case, if he were to be squeezed and prosecuted, he could talk about things as part of his legal right to defense that the U.S. government would rather remain classified. And if he's not allowed to provide a defense that he's entitled to because the U.S. government doesn't want that data to come out, then they basically have to drop all the charges. So I am predicting, continuing to predict, because I said it earlier this year, that in 2018, we will finally have a resolution to the probe looking into whether Trump colluded with the Russians. I'm predicting they will not find a smoking gun, that if it really existed, it would have been found by now, since it's not as if nobody knew this type of stuff was going on. The FBI is known for years. They've been part of it, as well as the president of the United States and, of course, the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, other countries as well. And I predict instead that some of the people around Trump who have worked for different political operatives, including the Democrats, will be nailed because they tend to go with whoever wants to write them a check. Let's be honest with you. And it's not a coincidence that both the Democrats and the Republicans are caught up in this scandal. You know, one of the things that has caused me to not support the Democrats anymore is the tremendous amount of hypocrisy that they often exhibit. And you might say, well, how can you support the Republicans? I don't support the Republicans. I'm actually politically neutral. I have said since the late 1990s that America is in desperate need of a third viable alternative party, one that is going to do the job that the American people want and that the Republicans and the Democrats refuse to do. So I've never voted Republican. I've never supported the Republicans. I'm not a conservative. I don't believe in the far right stuff. I don't believe in the far left stuff. Instead, I take each individual issue and each individual politician on their own merits or lack of, and I make decisions accordingly. I really don't care what party they belong to. I care what they stand for, what they can do. The reason I think America needs a viable third-party alternative is because both the Democrats and the Republicans have failed the American people. Nobody else has done it. They've been the only two powers, the two parties in power. So you can't blame anybody else but them because they're guilty. So we must remember that when Barack Obama ran for president, he slammed the incumbent, George Bush, for raking up a $10 trillion debt because of the Iraq War, because of what happened in Afghanistan, the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and so on. Valid point. He even said that it's irresponsible for any leader to rake up a debt of $10 trillion. So what does Obama do? He rakes up a debt of another $10 trillion. He leaves office after 2 terms in office. One can argue that the reason he got reelected is because his opponent, Mitt Romney, was even worse. And of course, John McCain running against Barack Obama, that was a joke. But he won 2 terms in office, and America is $20 trillion in debt. And because of the new tax cuts, which are expected to add as much as $1.5 trillion more to the deficit, before Trump leaves office, assuming he only serves 1 term, who knows, America will be around $22 trillion in debt. Now, common logic tells you that no nation can continue to function that way and still be prosperous and still remain a superpower. In fact, it's rather ironic that other smaller countries, they have financial crisis, like in Greece, when they're just tens of billions of dollars in debt. And yet here America is over 20 trillion in debt. Trillion is a lot bigger figure than a billion, of course. And yet it seems like nobody cares, or it seems that things continue to move along regardless. Look at the records that the stock market has broken. Look at the fact that companies are now paying Christmas bonuses again to their employees. Look how the gross domestic product has increased. And yet we're now over 20 trillion in debt. It makes no sense. It cannot continue. Something's got to give, especially when globally 1% of the richest people, the elite, the top 1%, own slightly over half of the entire planet's wealth. And as the United States being a perfect example of this, it's happening worldwide, the middle class continues to shrink. And about roughly half of the American people live either at or below the poverty level. So you combine these elements. There are other factors such as the rise of Asia, because it ultimately, let's be blunt about it, boils down to babies. When you've got 1/2 of the world cranking out larger families, this would be the Arab world, the Latinos, Latin American part of the populace. You've got, again, Africa, you've got the Middle East, and you've got Asia versus so-called white Europe, which is actually shrinking in population, as well as the United States. At least the white portion or Caucasian portion of the U.S. population is shrinking. You add all this up, and you have guaranteed change that's going to happen around the world. And as the the gravitational power, if you will, or center of power in the world starts to change towards Asia, what have you got over in Asia? You've got a mess. You've got India, which is a very dysfunctional democracy. It is the most corrupt democracy in the planet, as well as the world's largest. It's about to surpass China. It's on its way to eventually surpassing the United States. Asia is not ready to take over the mantle of responsibility and leadership there because China is communist. They're totalitarian dictatorship over there. That is not the future way to go for the betterment of humanity. So you add all these up. This doesn't include destroying the environment. It doesn't include that as many as 1/3 of people out there in manufacturing are going to lose their jobs to technology and increased automation. Somewhere out of all of this mess, and this is just scratching the surface, you've got to find solutions for this, and that is not what is happening. And unfortunately, that doesn't bode for a very good future. So in 2018, I am predicting 2 major trends for stories here. One is that Trump will not be found guilty of brazen one-on-one, mano-a-mano collusion with Russia and Vladimir Putin. Some of the people who did work for him were engaged in activities where they will be prosecuted, but it'll be for stuff that they did that had nothing to do with Trump and actually happened years earlier. Manafort is one example. The other thing that's going to happen is things are going to come to a head with North Korea and their rogue nuclear weapons program, and in another part of the world, the Middle East, the showdown pending between the Saudis and the Iranians, the old war that's been going on for over 1,400 years between Sunni and Shia Islam. These issues are coming to a head because the Sunnis are uniting with Israel, behind Israel. They're forgetting about the Palestinians. Events have moved beyond them. In Saudi Arabia, they declared Hamas to be a terrorist group. They declared a religious fatwa to no longer attack Jews and consider them to be the enemy. As these changes are happening, our failure to manage them responsibly, logically, and properly is going to determine what kind of year and whether they're successful or not in 2018. I'm predicting it's going to be a mixed bag because just enough legacy forces that want to continue to hold things back are going to continue to do that. They're going to be kicking and screaming all the way because the last thing they want